The remote nightmare. Megan Hartley sat in her home office, the glow from her laptop casting an eerie light on her face. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, its hands creeping towards midnight. She had been working from home for over a year now, ever since the pandemic had forced everyone into isolation. At first, it had seemed like a blessing, no more commutes, no more office politics. But as the months wore on, the solitude began to weigh on her. Her apartment was small but cosy, filled with personal touches and the comforting clutter of daily life. Tonight, though, it felt different. The air seemed heavier, the shadows deeper. Megan tried to shake off the unease that had settled over her as she returned to her work, typing furiously on her laptop. She was behind on a project and needed to meet the deadline by morning. Suddenly, her screen flickered and went black. She frowned, tapping the keys and checking the power cord. Everything seemed fine. She sighed, thinking it was just a temporary glitch, and decided to take a break. She stood up, stretching her legs and heading to the kitchen for a glass of water. As she filled her glass, she heard a faint noise coming from the living room. It was a soft, shuffling sound, like someone moving about. She froze, listening intently. The noise stopped, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. She returned to her office, determined to finish her work. When she sat back down, her laptop had turned back on. The document she had been working on was open, but the text was garbled, replaced with random symbols and characters. Her heart skipped a beat as she stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. She reached for her phone to call IT support, but there was no signal. A chill ran down her spine, and she glanced around the room. The shadows seemed to pulse and shift, creeping closer to her. She stood up again, feeling the walls closing in. She needed to get out of there to clear her head. She walked to the living room, intending to step outside for a breath of fresh air. As she approached the front door, she noticed it was slightly ajar. She was certain she had locked it earlier. Her pulse quickened, and she felt a surge of panic. She hesitated, listening for any signs of an intruder. The apartment was silent, the kind of oppressive silence that seemed to swallow sound. She took a deep breath and opened the door wider, peering into the hallway. It was empty, dimly lit by the flickering lights of the old building. Megan stepped out, her footsteps echoing softly on the hardwood floor. As she turned to go back inside, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Written on the wall in what looked like blood were the words, "You're not alone." Her breath caught in her throat and she stumbled back, her mind racing. She needed to call the police, but her phone still had no signal. She backed into her apartment, slamming the door shut and locking it. She grabbed a knife from the kitchen, her hands trembling. She felt trapped, the walls of her once safe haven closing in on her. She decided to check every room to make sure she was truly alone. She moved cautiously through the apartment, checking closets and under furniture. Each empty space brought only a fleeting sense of relief. She reached her bedroom last, the door creaking as she pushed it open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows on the walls. As she stepped inside, she saw a figure standing by the window, staring out into the night. Her heart pounded in her chest as she raised the knife, her voice trembling. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure turned slowly, revealing a face that was disturbingly familiar. It was her own. The doppelganger smiled a twisted, malevolent grin that sent chills down Megan's spine. "You invited me in," it said, its voice a distorted echo of her own. "You opened the door." Megan backed away, her mind reeling. "This isn't real, this can't be real." The doppelganger stepped closer, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "Oh, it's very real, Megan, and now I'm here to stay." Megan turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping her in the room with the entity. She felt a cold hand on her shoulder, and she screamed, swinging the knife wildly. But the blade passed through the figure as if it were made of smoke. The room spun, and Megan felt herself being pulled into the darkness, the shadows wrapping around her like tendrils. The last thing she saw was the twisted grin of her doppelganger, watching her with cold, unfeeling eyes. When the police arrived the next morning, responding to a neighbour's report of a disturbance, they found the apartment empty. There were no signs of a struggle, no clues to where Megan had gone. Her laptop was still open, displaying the same garbled text. The words on the wall had disappeared, leaving only a faint stain behind. Megan Hartley was never seen again. The shadows in the house. When 16-year-old Lily's parents decided to take a weekend trip, leaving her alone in their creaky old house, she was thrilled. It meant freedom, no curfews, no chores, and she could binge-watch horror movies without any interruptions. But as the sun set on that first night, excitement gave way to an uneasy feeling she couldn't quite shake. The house was old, having stood on its foundation for over a century. It had been remodelled over the years, but the original structure remained. It was filled with hidden nooks and crannies, secret doors, and an attic no one ever dared to enter. After watching a couple of slasher films, Lily felt uneasy but told herself it was just the movies messing with her head. She locked the front and back doors, checked the windows, and turned off all the lights except for the living room lamp before heading upstairs to her bedroom. Around midnight, she was jarred awake by a loud thud from downstairs. Heart pounding, she sat up and strained to listen. The house groaned and settled as it always did, but this sound had been different, louder, more deliberate. She told herself it was probably just the old house playing tricks on her. Unable to ignore it, Lily grabbed her phone and crept down the stairs, trying to keep her steps light and quiet. As she reached the bottom, she saw that the living room light was off. She distinctly remembered leaving it on. A shiver ran down her spine and she turned on the flashlight on her phone. She scanned the room, her eyes darting to every shadow and corner. The room seemed empty, but the unsettling feeling that she wasn't alone persisted. She took a deep breath and convinced herself to check the kitchen. Maybe she had just forgotten to lock the back door. In the kitchen, she found the back door locked and secure. As she turned to leave, she noticed the basement door slightly ajar. Her parents always kept it closed. Her throat tightened as she stared at the dark gap. Swallowing her fear, she approached the door and pulled it shut, locking it with a swift turn of the latch. She tried to tell herself it must have been the wind, even though every fibre of her being knew that wasn't possible. She returned to her room, trying to calm her racing heart. She locked her bedroom door, got back into bed and pulled the covers up to her chin. She kept her phone clutched in her hand, the flashlight still on, casting an eerie glow in the dark room. Just as she was beginning to relax, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the stairs. They were slow, deliberate, and growing louder. Lily's breath hitched, and she dialed 911, her fingers trembling. As the operator picked up, Lily whispered, "Someone's in my house." The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and stopped. The operator asked her to stay calm and stay on the line while they dispatched the police. Lily nodded, even though the operator couldn't see her, and tried to steady her breathing. A soft creak came from just outside her bedroom door. Whoever was there was now in the hallway, right outside her room. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying it was just her imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by the horror movies. Then the doorknob rattled. Lily's eyes flew open and she stared at the door, willing it to stay shut. The knob rattled again, more violently this time. She could hear the operator's voice faintly through the phone, telling her help was on the way, but it seemed so distant, so far removed from the reality of the terror she was experiencing. The rattling stopped, and silence fell. She dared not move, barely breathing, her eyes locked on the door. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Then, a whisper, so soft she almost missed it. "Lily." Her blood ran cold. How did they know her name? She fought the urge to scream, biting down hard on her lip. The whisper came again, more insistent. "Lily, let me in." She shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. She could hear the operator now, urging her to stay calm, saying the police were almost there. But the voice outside the door was all she could focus on. The doorknob rattled one last time, followed by a heavy thud against the door, as if something, or someone, was trying to break it down. Lily's mind raced with thoughts of who it could be and how they had gotten inside. Suddenly, the sound of sirens in the distance filled the air, growing louder and closer. The thudding stopped abruptly. She could hear hurried footsteps retreating down the stairs. She stayed on the line with the operator until the police arrived, their lights casting flashing patterns through her bedroom window. She unlocked her door and rushed downstairs, meeting the officers at the front door, her body trembling with relief and residual fear. The police searched the house, finding no one. The basement door was open again, and muddy footprints were leading down the stairs. They followed the trail and found an old, hidden passageway in the basement, leading out into the forest behind the house. It was clear that whoever had been inside knew the house's secrets far better than anyone should. The police assured Lily they would patrol the area and keep an eye on the house, but the sense of security she once felt in her home was shattered. That night and many nights after, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, waiting in the shadows. And as the days turned into weeks, she began to wonder if the house itself was cursed, harbouring dark secrets and whispering voices that only came out when you were truly alone and vulnerable.